Imagine stepping into a world where the majority of people couldn't read or write. This wasn't some distant, mythical past. It was just a few centuries ago in Europe. In the early 1500s, the ability to read and write was a rare and valuable skill, reserved for a select few. The first readers were not just the lucky ones, but also the persistent ones. They were the businessmen who needed to keep track of their trades, the middle and upper class women who craved romantic stories, and the curious individuals who wanted to learn more about the world around them. Back then, being able to read and write was a huge deal. It meant you could understand important documents, communicate with others far away, and access a world of knowledge that was otherwise closed to you. But here's the shocking part. Over half of the male population in Europe couldn't read at all, and the rate among women was even higher, at about 89%. This means that if you were a woman in the 1500s, chances are you couldn't read a single word. But why was literacy so rare? Well, for starters, there were no public schools like we have today. Education was mostly a private affair, and it was expensive. Only the wealthy could afford to send their children to school, and even then, the education was often basic. Most people, especially those in rural areas, had to learn on their own or from family members. If you were lucky, you might have a local priest or a traveling teacher who could help you learn. The first readers were a mix of different people, each with their own reasons for wanting to learn. Businessmen needed to keep track of their trades and transactions, so they were some of the first to see the value in reading and writing. They would often hire scribes to help them, but as the demand for written records grew, more and more businessmen learned to do it themselves. Middle and upper class women, on the other hand, wanted to read for different reasons. They were often confined to their homes and had limited social lives, so reading provided a way to escape and explore new worlds. They would read romance novels, religious texts, and sometimes even philosophical works. This desire for literature helped fuel the demand for books and, in turn, the spread of literacy. But let's talk about the numbers. The clergy and professionals were almost entirely literate, with only 0% of them being unable to read. The gentry, or the upper class, had a literacy rate of 98%. As you moved down the social ladder, the rates dropped dramatically. Yeomen, or small farmers, had a literacy rate of 65%, while craftsmen were at 56%. Peasants, who made up the majority of the population, had a literacy rate of just 21%. Laborers, the lowest on the social scale, had a literacy rate of only 15%. These figures might seem surprising, but they reflect the stark social and economic divides of the time. Education was a luxury, and those who had it used it to maintain their status and power, but there were exceptions. Some grocers, for example, were 94% literate, while haberdashers were 91% literate. Merchants were 88% literate, and even bakers, innkeepers, and brewers had higher literacy rates than you might expect. Tailors, blacksmiths, and butchers were less likely to be literate, and the rates dropped further for sailors, carpenters, and gardeners. Shepherds, bricklayers, and thatchers had the lowest literacy rates of all, with most of them unable to read or write at all. But here's another interesting fact. These literacy rates were for reading the vernacular, or the common languages of the people, like Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, Dutch, Flemish, Danish, German, and Tuscan Italian. Latin, on the other hand, was still the language of the elite. It was the language of the church, scholars, scientists, governments, and the courts. If you wanted to be taken seriously in these circles, you needed to know Latin. In France in 1501, for example, 80 volumes were published in Latin, while only 8 were published in French. In Aragon, between 1510 and 1540, 115 books were printed in Latin, and just 5 in Spanish. Latin dominated the book market throughout the 16th century, especially at the annual Frankfurt Book Fair. Latin's dominance had several reasons. It was the language of international communication, and if you wanted to reach a European audience, you had to use it. In countries where the native languages were less widely known, like Flemish, German, and English, Latin was the preferred language. However, there were some who preferred the colloquial languages. When the famous French surgeon Ambroise Paré published his work on treating gunshot wounds in French, he faced criticism from his colleagues at the Faculty of Medicine in Paris. The church also strongly opposed the use of vernacular languages, and authors were hesitant to use them because of the inconsistency in spelling and grammar. For example, in an English manuscript, B could be written as B, grief as grief, these as these, sword as sword, nurse as Norse, and servant as servant. Despite these challenges, the use of vernacular languages gradually increased. Monastic schools continue to teach in Latin, focusing on the trivium grammar, rhetoric, and dialectics, and the quadrivium astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, and music. Young monks and country youth learned a basic form of Latin that was enough to understand political and religious pamphlets. This knowledge would become important later, as more people began to read and write in their native languages. Outside the monasteries, the reading public was growing, though not by design. There were no new literacy programs, and education remained chaotic. Those who received any formal education had to be either lucky or persistent. The number of schools increased, and as more books were printed, the desire to learn to read and write spread like wildfire. Millions of Europeans brought their children to classrooms and stayed to learn themselves. Classes often included women eager to explore literature and philosophy, and middle class, adolescents considering careers in trade. Education was available in three forms: popular education, apprenticeship, and formal schooling at traditional schools and universities. Popular education was the most common, but it was also the least structured. Teachers were often barely literate themselves, and the curriculum was limited to reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and the catechism. Despite this, the efforts of thousands of humble individuals laid the foundation for the popularity of vernacular literature and the spread of general knowledge. As the years went by, the use of vernacular languages continued to grow. Books and pamphlets in these languages became more common, and more people learned to read and write. The dream of a unified Christendom with a single Latin tongue gradually faded, and the world became more diverse and complex. The first readers, with their persistence and curiosity, helped pave the way for the modern world we know today. Their stories remind us that the power of literacy is one of the greatest tools for change and progress.